Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony Xperia Tablet Z. So as you may have noticed, we've got two tablets here in frame. The Xperia Tablet Z is on the left, and its predecessor, the Xperia Tablet S, is on the right. Now these are two very, very different tablets, not only in that they are a generation apart, but the Z does represent an entire rebuild from the ground up in terms of Sony's offering in the Android, or I should say tablet space. So what are we looking at? For those of you who don't know about the Z and have missed my previous coverage before I really get down to business here, we're looking at a 10.1-inch 1920 by 1080 display, which is quite frankly the best on the market, despite being slightly lower than other top tier tablets. In my opinion right now, the best screen on the market is right here in the Z. You're also getting the slimmest and lightest 10.1-inch tablet in the world, which is important because one of the most important things about using any tablet is its form factor and practicality in actual use. If something's a dead weight, like much of the first-gen tablets, you simply aren't going to want to use it. And what I can tell you about the Z right now at the beginning of this video is that it is an absolute joy to use, and that's because it really does redefine the expectations, at least that I've had, for a 10.1-inch tablet in terms of practical usability, because there's no question with most 10.1-inch slabs or slates tablets, you're going to get some significant risk fatigue after a significant amount of use. With this tablet, we've had, at least in my opinion, a breakthrough. So that's really important. The display, fantastic, also really important. Now, in terms of specifications, we've got some pretty solid specs under the hood. You've got a Snapdragon S4 Pro, which is a solid processor, and certainly nothing to scoff at. However, Sony's a little bit late with this, simply because we've got the 800 on the way, as well as the Tegra 4 right around the corner, literally probably less than a month away from seeing all sorts of manufacturers laying down their latest and greatest hardware. So this chip, at least for right now, is one of the best on the market, but that's going to change in the next month. So something to consider, but moving along, 2 gigs of RAM, 16 or 32 gigs of internal storage, priced at $499 or $599 respectively. You do have a micro SD card slot for storage expansion, as well as a micro USB port for charging, file transfer, and video out. It does have a higher water resistance rating than the predecessor, the S, which was only splash proof. This can actually be submerged for up to 30 minutes in up to 3 feet of water. So that's really significant in terms of waterproofing. They've really redone the entire design. I'll be commenting on that. But that's what it comes down to in terms of specifications, at least the ones that I think most of you are going to be looking at. Wi-Fi, pretty much the same as what's found in the Xperia Tablet S. Key difference is that the Z does not have any of the connectivity issues that the S had at launch. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But the point is that if you know about the Wi-Fi issues, don't worry, they don't exist with the Z. Now, if you're wondering why we've been looking at these tablets turned off, it's to make one point out of the gate and then do a demonstration, which is that you may have noticed you cannot see where the bezel and screen actually begin and end on the Z, which is actually significant. This is I won't say a revolutionary design, but it sort of is, in that no other tablet manufacturer has gotten this down, and it's impressive, and I actually quite like it. The only time you'll ever actually be able to notice the difference between where the bezel and screen begin and end is probably when you're cleaning it, which you will be doing quite frequently, because it is a fingerprint magnet, despite the fact that it's got that dust-proof layer of coating there. It seems to pick up more fingerprints than just about any tablet I've seen. So keep that in mind. But the other thing I wanted to demonstrate is that on this generational gap we have here, I think a lot of you want to see how much faster that Snapdragon S4 is than the last gen Tegra 3. So what I'm going to do, very rudimentary, nothing scientific here, is just simply boot up each tablet. Now keep in mind they are running different versions of Android, even though they're both in Jelly Bean. The Z does have a later build. Unfortunately, the Z still isn't up to snuff, though, with the current generation of software. You're not getting a Nexus experience here. Don't expect that. But the good news about the Z is that it is basically completely open, so development is plentiful, and that's a very big change of pace for what the average consumer could expect from a Sony product. You know, if you pick up something from Toshiba, good luck. You are not going to get an open device, I assure you of that. So even though you will be getting something with a Tegra 4 in there, you're not going to have the ability to do anything beyond really what's offered in the stock experience from Toshiba. So Sony, good move there, definitely a good thing. But let me go ahead and boot them up, because I do think that's something that people will actually take as some sort of indication of performance. And you'll also immediately see a difference in the screen quality. As I mentioned, you've got a 1920 by 1080 display on here. It incorporates Sony's Bravia mobile engine. This is the second generation, or they're calling it 2, and it is really impressive in terms of representing a very wide gamut of colors, something you're not going to find on older tablets, or even many of the latest tablets that have even higher resolution displays than the Z, such as whether it's the Nexus 10, iPad, even the brand new Transformer, as well as Toshiba's new offering. I'm sure the Galaxy Note 3, all of these devices will most likely, in fact the announced ones already do, have higher resolution screens than the Z. I'm mentioning that because I think most of you that are shopping this tablet right now will find that interesting. Now, you saw the difference in boot time. Certainly an interesting thing to point out. In terms of software, they are very, very similar. They both have infrared remote control systems, something I didn't mention when I was going over specifications. I also didn't mention Bluetooth connectivity or NFC. NFC is a new addition to this tablet. I don't think that's a tremendous selling point, but I will be covering it. I say that only because NFC is something that simply most people aren't really using yet. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be. It's just a matter of practical use, like most things. So you can already see there's a quality difference in the screen, and that's not just the resolution. Granted, this is last gen. You're looking at a much lower res experience and a smaller display, 9.4 inch. So really, as I mentioned before, completely different goal here, in my opinion, even though both of these tablets were designed to be media consumption devices. This one, I did really happen to like that it had a full-size SD card slot. I wish that Sony had not abandoned that, but it's good to see that they still included storage expansion here, because as we know, some tablet manufacturers don't offer that capability. So something I'm always looking for is the most flexibility in a device, and when it comes to being a pure tablet, the Z really does shine. A lot of tablets try to be more, such as the Transformer, and they do so well. They have their quirks, and most of us, come to either love or hate them, or just live with them. The one thing I can tell you right now is that there are very few things that the Z does not exceed in. In terms of its overall performance, it is right now the fastest tablet on the market. Benchmarks indicate such, as does day-to-day use. There's really nothing that I've had problems with on here. When you actually first load up your tablet, sync your account, and this applies to any tablet you buy today, you're going to have, at least initially in that first half hour of syncing and adding all of your apps, a bit of lag. Don't interpret that as an indication of overall behavior or performance for any tablet. I want you guys to know that. For those of you who see that happen and then worry that your tablet's defective or just a piece of junk, that's not the case. In order, like any computer, once it's doing something that intensive, especially it's a one-time task, you have to understand that you're going to experience a slowdown there. But after that, this tablet just really flies. It isn't perfect. I'm going to tell you guys some of the missteps that Sony made with this, but there are very few, and that's really what's important here, because with most tablets, especially this one on the right, the last generation, there were more than a few missteps, and that's really what ended up determining whether or not it was a success or a failure. And I think that's why the Z really has a lot going for it. So I've mentioned the phenomenal screen. I've told you guys the processor is right now top of the line, but soon to be, I won't say outdated, because it won't be. It will have longevity. My only fear is that in 3 to 6 months, the Z is really going to just be all about its form factor and the fact that it's got waterproofing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think the general market isn't going to really necessarily care about the performance difference between an S4 or the 800 or a Tegra 4, because in day-to-day use, it's going to be very similar. It's really going to matter to people who are really heavy users, gamers. Those are the people that are going to care more about the performance offered by more bleeding edge processors. So that's one thing I really want to point out if you're worried about the fact that I mentioned earlier, that the S4 it's not dated, but it's not latest and greatest like the balance of this device in terms of being revolutionary. That's the one area I wish Sony really would have done us a solid, because had it been released maybe at the same time as it was in Japan, then I would understand, but otherwise it made it into the States basically in the exact same quarter that all the latest chips are about to launch. So I can't give Sony any credit there. The infrared remote application on both of these tablets, fantastic. But beyond the actual overall comparison, because really there's no comparison between these two, the S is a great buy right now as a Tegra 3 device that's really inexpensive, that you have to understand isn't going to get any more software support, but in its current state, I think it's a great buy. I've seen them as low as $300 brand new for a 32 gig unit. Sony was throwing in accessories. So really, if you can get these now at those low prices, I think it's one of the best tablets money can buy. But if you want latest and greatest, you're looking at it here with the Z, because it's fixed basically every possible complaint that you could have with this. Whether we start with the waterproofing disaster that the S had, which was basically, even though this was just splash proof, it did have a seal problem. That seal problem is gone. Here we've got a tablet that can basically, I won't say live underwater, but you're not going to worry about taking this out in the elements. In fact, because the camera is relatively decent, that 8 megapixel rear camera on this tablet, you can actually use that as a waterproof camera. Now, I never use tablets as cameras, but I have to say, as someone who is constantly reviewing camera hardware, and I'm not a big fan of the waterproof cameras out there. I'm more of a housing guy. Would rather take a quality camera in a housing than try to get the best of both worlds. Compromise usually gives you compromised results. So with this tablet, what's nice is that you do actually have a camera that can go out in bad weather, which certainly isn't a selling point. Sony's not marketing that, but I think it's a pretty cool and unique thing. You couldn't do that with this, obviously. Splash resistant, and that was if you didn't get one that Sony had to repair because of a seal issue. So completely different in that arena. You've got a much better screen here. This IPS display was fantastic. As a photographer, having a full-size SD card slot and being able to review photos on the fly was great. But clearly, having a screen like this is much better for a photographer, because now you've got a lot more resolution to leverage. With the sensors that are out there now, full frame, you're going to really appreciate a screen like this, especially in terms of color accuracy. Not that this IPS last-gen display is inferior to much of what's out there. In fact, I think it's on par with much of the competition, just lower res. So really like the S in the form it is now, but also you've got to deal with the fact that, as I mentioned, locked down. So very similar, though, in terms of the software build. You can see up in the left corner next to the Google Voice search, you do have all of Sony's little icons that you can basically drag and drop and customize as shortcuts. You have the same exact launchers down in the center here for the infrared remote control feature, which does allow for macros, which is a great thing. Samsung's Galaxy Note that I reviewed, the 10-inch tablet, does also offer similar functionality, but no macros. So that's something specific to Sony, really unique. They also do offer the TV Side View app, which essentially will give you access to your local guide in a picture format and allow you to basically pick a program, swipe it up, and it'll change your television to that channel, which is really unique. That does exist also with the previous gen. That's one of the reasons I really like the value here, at least at this point. Back when it retailed, it was solid in its group of peers. However, problems, as I mentioned before, as well as software issues, Wi-Fi issues, did lead, unfortunately, to its short-lived existence. But the Z doesn't suffer from any of those things. In fact, it builds upon all of it But the 2 gigs of RAM keep it going on multitasking the way you'd expect from the current generation of tablets right now in the top tier. And the screen is just absolutely phenomenal. I like what Sony's done with the custom software. It's not too bloated, as I mentioned in my previous update on this tablet, which is significant because you do expect a company like Sony to just lay it on. And quite frankly, beyond their media services, because after all, Sony owns a ton of media. You've got to remember that for those of you who have forgotten. They want to sell it, and I don't blame them. There are very few companies that are making tablets that really do own so much media. So Sony, arguably the only company that really should be throwing this stuff at you. And furthermore, because everything is open on here, you can get rid of it. You know, go install whatever you like. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Z. Those limitations that were here are gone in this generation. So basically an upgrade in every single respect, even in that waterproofing, as I mentioned before. You've got a better screen, better processor, double the RAM. You know, arguably some will think micro SD card slot is better than full. And it is for certain purposes, because after all, a micro SD card can be, you know, hot swap between smartphones and other tablets that full-size SD cards simply don't have the flexibility of being able to work with. Now, in terms of battery life, both very, very similar, a little bit better here with the Z, and I'm going to attribute that to the newer processor. Despite the screen being brilliant, and definitely a hog, if you keep brightness levels in check, you're looking at somewhere around, I would say, 8 hours of use, possibly 9. If you're going to crank the brightness up, forget about it. You know, you're dropping into another league, and that's because this tablet is so thin, Sony really couldn't get a bigger battery in there. So battery life, very similar. I mentioned before, no Wi-Fi disconnection issues like this tablet has. Even in the latest current gen of the firmware, it still will always disable Wi-Fi whenever you turn the backlight off. Not happening here. Another little cool feature I want to point out, you can enable this when the tablet is sleeping. You can essentially bring it to life. It's an option by double tapping, which I think is pretty cool. Doesn't exist on the previous generation. Just wanted to point that out to you guys. But the software experience is very similar. It's just that this is relatively lag-free, whereas that can't be said for the Tegra 3 generation of devices, especially when compared to current top-end devices like the Note 10, obviously the Nexus 10. These are the tablets that are right now the current standard. So the Z, in my opinion, surpasses all of those. The Nexus 10 and Z are very similar on actual performance, but the Z does trump it in terms of screen quality, and in my opinion, the form factor really takes the cake, waterproofing aside. So that's important to note. I want to show you guys also, since we're talking about generational gaps, and I've been talking about, you know, if you pick up the Z, what are you going to be giving up in the brand new tablet lineups with better processors that are on the way? So let me just at least, even though I can't show you guys the difference between the Z and the next gen, I can show you at least the difference here between it and its predecessor. So if I open up Chrome in each, which I'm going to do right now, and this will also, as I mentioned, give you guys an idea of screen quality. Let me go ahead and just pull up website. You'll see keyboards pretty much identical. Not a whole lot of difference here, but let's just, let's see, what should we go to? Let's try ESPN. There we go. Oh, nope. That test failed. Let me back it up. Try this again. See if we can get it this time. I mean, basically what I've noticed is that, you know, clearly there is a difference in performance, but it isn't tremendous. And that's significant because when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, I think a lot of users really are expecting a whole nother world when they get a brand new piece of hardware that is supposed to replace the previous gen. And you can see they're pretty close. I mean, despite the fact that you've got a whole different set of hardware, and I am without a doubt telling you guys right now, this is the best tablet on the market, the Z. These are close when it comes to browsing on Chrome. In terms of the actual smoothness, there's no question you're going to get a better experience out of the Z, and you should. But they are, again, really, really close. And the point I'm making here by emphasizing that is that when this new generation of chips hits the market that I mentioned, whether it's the Qualcomm 800, even if it's the the 600, or you're dealing with the Tegra 4, which is still right now looking like the beast to beat. When it comes to simple things like web browsing, you aren't going to see a crazy jump in performance. So that's really what I wanted to demonstrate here with just a simple test like that of showing you guys, going from one website to another. I could also bring up CNN, again, just to show you what things look like, and it's going to demonstrate pretty much the same point. We'll see if this time I can get them at the same time, since I was not perfectly on time before. And there you have it. Very close again. You can see the Z is swiping before the S. In terms of pinch to zoom, both are pretty smooth. But screen quality, I think you guys should get a good idea, since we're looking at the same stuff here. I'm not giving you different web pages to look at. We're doing a one-for-one comparison. And I still think that the IPS screen on the older Xperia S is gorgeous. I think it should come through on the video here. But there's no question this is best in the business. So if you want the best, you're looking at it in the Z. Not only because you got a larger screen, but again, color accuracy and viewing angles are right there with IPS, even though it's not an IPS display. So that's something I think everyone needs to know. Now, I've emphasized a lot about what's to like about this tablet, clearly. In fact, right now, if you've been watching this, you might think this is a perfect tablet, even though, earlier in the video I did mention it isn't. And I'm going to discuss some of those things now because they're warranted, and as I mentioned, no device is perfect. The Xperia Tablet S, a very large list of problems, most of which have been resolved in, I would say, or I should say for the most part. And still, as I mentioned, a great value in my opinion. It does just about everything that I even need it to do. Granted, things could be smoother, and that's really what the Z represents in my opinion. So if right now you're looking to purchase a tablet, and you must buy it, I would say, even within this month, the Z is without question the best tablet money can buy. So if you can pick it up with an EDU discount from Sony or tax-free through Amazon, I think you'll be very pleased with this, and it will have staying power despite the fact that it doesn't have, the best processor that will about to drop, and that's important to note. And part of that, as I mentioned earlier, was me demonstrating at least a very basic generation gap and showing you guys that, things are moving forward. I mean, benchmarks, we're looking at something like with Antutu here, you're looking at 20,000, whereas last generation with the Tegra 3, something around 13,000. The Qualcomm 800 and the Tegra 4 are all benchmarking well over, or I should say, in the 30,000. So it's not quite a double, but it's close, at least on paper. But in day-to-day use, I have to reemphasize that's going to be a completely different experience. Cameras here are right now also the best on any tablet. Waterproofing, it's not proofing, but resistance, also the best only tablet on the market. And as I mentioned, the form factor is just so critical. To me, the Z is really all about, at the end of the day, when all those new chips hit and they have all their different features, this is going to be one of the only 10-inch tablets on the market still that will have that waterproofing, have, at least in my opinion, solid cameras for a tablet that are even waterproof, or I, again, should emphasize resistant, but usable. And to boot, this is one of the only comfortable form factors because of its weight on the market. And that design is really what makes this tablet a winner. And that, in many ways, can outlast a processor. I mean, speak to Apple users. They're not all about the processor, and that applies to just about every consumer. Apple users are not unique in that. And I think that's part of what Sony hedged on here is that, the S4 isn't a slouch, but they're hoping that's really not the only thing you're interested in. And I think if you're after the Z, you're clearly admitting that because the form factor and screen really are its two biggest selling points. The specifications and water resistance are just cherries, really. So especially the storage expansion and really the openness that the tablet represents, hopefully developers will stay with this. Now, I want to get this tablet out of here. But the last thing I want to say about the last gen, because it does still have its place, as I mentioned, if you're looking for an inexpensive Tegra 3 well-made tablet, you're looking at it here. Solidly built, it does have water resistance, just can't be submerged because it doesn't have anything to cover its headphone jack, unlike the Z, which we're going to get a little bit closer up with. Metal construction, something the Z abandoned, but you still have that plastic backing here where all the antennas are, the magazine folded cover style, which was totally abandoned. Power buttons also completely different, and volume rocker redesigned on the Z. So really different. Full-size SD card slot here, also completely different audio on the Z, so just not even remotely similar in any way. The only thing that's really similar is that they have the same infrared remote control gimmick, I will say, even though it's far from a gimmick, but beyond that, there's really nothing else other than their software environments that really evoke the same feeling that you're using a product from the same manufacturer. So with that said, let's get a little bit tight here with the Z. And what I want to talk about in terms of the actual problems that I'm aware of. First and foremost, I've noticed flex, and people have asked me about this flex issue. It seems that when you're holding the tablet by the bezel, which so easily blends in with the screen, it'll often register screen touches when you are not actually touching the screen. So that's what I meant by flex in order to clarify. I attributed that to flex because, quite frankly, there's no other reason I could at least think of that false touches would be registering on this gorgeous screen. So what recently happened back on June 9th, Sony did push out an update, which I'm going to show you guys right now, the version of that update. And that update ended up, at least in my opinion, resolving that. So I'm going to now retract the fact that I thought we were dealing with an actual issue that was hardware based, because apparently that is not the case. So as you notice down there, the build number is now .370. That is the latest build here in the US, and from what I understand, that was all about addressing the screen sensitivity issue, that magical mispress. Some people also reporting that it was actually tracking previous presses, at attempts to get the right thing. So it was like tracing touches and mapping them essentially when you weren't even touching the screen anymore. Those things are gone. Also, fluidity in actual gestures and scrolling, that was a bit of an issue. There was a little bit of lag, really negligible, nothing that I would consider anything outside of what's in the marketplace, even in the top tier. That also seems to be no longer existent. So something to point out, I think important, that was I would say probably the most major technical flaw with this tablet out of the box. Also, the fact that Sony, as I mentioned earlier, did not include the TV side view app was definitely odd. It just spoke to them rushing to get this out, which is also ironic because this came out so much later here in the US than at least Japan at the very least. So I'm not sure why this wasn't fully polished in that sense, because after all, side view launched with this and is still on the older generation tablet, so it's kind of I can just scratch my head as to why, but that's not a big deal because you can get that in the Play Store. So kind of irrelevant, but just bizarre, because you want to market that infrared remote control application. It's got macro capability, which means you can actually train it to do a series of controls in order to turn on all of your equipment, turn off all of your equipment the same way something like a Harmony remote would. So that's really impressive, extra value added bonus in this tablet, much like its predecessor that I just had on the table. In terms of the waterproofing, that's the next thing I'm going to talk about, because even though this has been certified, and part of the major design change was the fact that now all of the actual ports, if I can get them in focus, are covered, something that we didn't have on the last generation. Right there at the top left is the headphone port. The reason I'm focusing on that, or at least trying to get the camera to focus on that, is because I have read reports of people having issues with this specific port. No other port on the tablet has had seal problems, but I have read about some people complaining that they were not able to keep this completely shut, and then when they did their water test or just took it to the pool or beach, whatever it was, water ended up getting in there and damaging the tablet. So keep that in mind. I don't want any of you to have that problem. Obviously, nobody wants to break a tablet. If you notice that that's not completely closing, do yourself a favor and take it back or return it to whoever you purchased it from. Sony has been kind enough, from what I've learned in the past month, to even repair and replace people's units that have ended up breaking in that manner, because clearly if the latches aren't staying closed, it's not user error, although it could be if you don't close them. So keep that in mind. If you're going to submerge this tablet, you do need to have all of the ports closed. So that's the charging port at the bottom, the headphone jack, and the micro SD card slot on the right side.